So right out of the gate here, I'd like to continue with where we left off on the last episode. And one important point of clarification is that we've been building this sort of philosophical grammar and an architecture behind it to describe what we are seeing in this landscape. But it can be confused by inconsistencies in language that is being used in the dialogue. So, in particular, the word that has come up time and again, or perhaps just recently, but time and again recently, has been the word property. In some sense, we've developed a level or layer of analysis. The layer of analysis is particular to my ontology. That property as a word is a descriptive feature of instantiation, whereas in the Parmenides dialectic, it is meant as a logical predicate. Now, in terms of the meaning of that word, of predicate, it is what is said of a subject, kind of broad. It is the determination, attribute, or relation that is affirmed or denied about something. And so it has two parts, as the subject, the thing that's being spoken about, and then the predicate, what is said about that thing, what is said of the thing. So the lamp is bright, our predicate is brightness. The subject is the lamp. So, while the language that is being used here by Parmenides, he's using the word property, but it's at a deeper layer than our ontological grammar has afforded us so far. And it's not deeper in the sense that it's more sophisticated, but it's just literally a deeper layer of considering where we are. For when I mentioned qualities in the first place, it is meant more so, again, as a descriptive feature of instantiation. This is farther on down the line than our sort of pre-descriptive identity and the principal interaction between oneness and being, the one, difference, and other determinate language, like inside, outside, this, not this, otherness, which is difference. And again, says Parmenides, in this way, must not everything that is to touch something lie next to that which it is to touch, occupying the position adjacent to that occupied by what it touches. Okay, let's pause here. I'm not sure when it happened, but we reached this point where we've had like this explosion of language. And it's a bit disorienting and confusing. So what I said at the outset stands. We have to keep that in mind. But we're at the point where we can say we have these ideas of properties, in the sense that Parmenides uses it, as these sort of determinate ways that something can be described as. Or the predicate, let's say. And all of these different predicates when we think about them in relation to the one, and then do this sort of jarring comparison to otherness, we find ourselves in a strange position. Why is it a strange position? It's a strange position because it almost seems like it's never ending. Like there's no clear answer to the dilemma. And it's not perhaps that it ought to be seen as something that is unfortunate, but rather it's confusing by the angle of approach. Perhaps I could be wrong about that, but there are many times that we've gone through different exercises where this has made itself more clear. Well, I'll attempt to do some of that now. But we just finished in the last episode talking about different predicates. We talked about like and unlike. We talked about same versus different. We used the word opposite. And some of these are sort of overlapping terms. We're now using the word touch. And so I think instead of looking at this and thinking that we're going around in circles, rather we should think about it as we are establishing nodes in the network. And these predicate nodes are going to be important in terms of understanding how the one can manifest or nurture difference and give rise to the ontological structure that we have established throughout this series. That is, how identity can be formed from very basic principles and things that are not very descriptive into things that become increasingly descriptive, and eventually things that we all seemingly recognize, like material objects, like my cat, my water bottle, my book, myself. So let's return to the one and these predicates. Predicates, the term that we've been using to separate out from our ontological framework, but also maintain similarity or equivalence to the word that is being used as property here, that Parmenides uses. And what about this? Parmenides says, consider the question whether the one touches or does not touch itself and the others. So let's consider that question. So with regard to touching, if I touch myself, for example, there's an approximation. There is an establishment of some relation. There's a meeting, there's a joining. Now, the touching of self in this context, I have to think about the purpose and the expression of the one. So if I think if the one is to touch itself, what exactly would that mean? Well, it would mean that the way in which it moves, the way in which it expresses itself, has some influence on itself. So if we're in the bodily case, if I am expressing myself materially, moving out into the world, and I touch myself, that involves physical action, involves intent, purpose. When we think about the one, we think about oneness and being. So does the one touch these principles at all? And of course it does. It is something that it occupies being, and it also is one thing, which are the principles that it expresses. ironically enough. And when we think about others, the answer also is yes. And there's nothing that does not participate in this expression of coherence between the oneness and being. Surely the one was shown to be in itself as a whole. Isn't the one also in the others? Then insofar as it is in the others, it would touch the others. But insofar as it is in itself, it would be kept from touching the others. And being in itself would touch itself. So let's talk about this dynamic, this potential dynamic in which we're considering the one touching the many and touching itself. So when we say that it is touching itself, it's participating with oneness and being outside of otherness. And so as it does this, we understand that the one's unique relationship to itself is different from multiplicity or otherness. Because the relationship that the one has with the principles that coheres and are expressed by it are different from those angular expressions of oneness. Now the thing is, how would we describe that difference? Because on a principled level, principled layer, they seemingly all participate in the same way. And for the lack of a better image, I still think in this linear progression, in the sense that when we move away from these, or move out from, extend away from these principles, what we have is a specification function that takes place. Specification function within the tiered system. What do I mean by that? Within the layers of things, what we find is the possibility for difference to be, the effects of difference to be compounded. Okay, what do I mean by that? If we have difference at the outset, we have our non-descript terms, but we have our determinate terms. This, not that. We have inside, outside. We have this and other. We have one and other. And as we add things on top of this, now the layer past this we really haven't talked too much about, because there are two main issues. One is, what is the reason that difference would exist at all, other than to cohere, or other than be responsible for the coherence of oneness and being? Why is it the case that it would differentiate at all into other things? And even to the point where we find ourselves considering the most basic determinate features, why does it branch out from determinate features into things that are more descript? Why isn't there just an ontological world that is just nondescript but determinate? Why is it the case that it's both determinate and descriptive? So that's one level. What is it within this structure that, almost like a fluid, like blood that flows through a a system to provide oxygen, which is essential for energy, which is essential for the generation of bodily processes, cellular function, and ultimately the execution of purpose. Goal-directed behavior. If this structure already exists, then it seems to indicate, or at least point towards, a directionality, which I have been sort of considering as purpose. Now, we don't want to get too far ahead of our skis here, rationally speaking, but it is an interesting dilemma that's not solved yet. The second thing is, how do we get from descript, or rather determinate, to descript, from nondescript to descript? And much like, I think, a foundation of a house, or a foundation in general, we are taking something that perhaps it's descriptive by nature, of course, but it's not as descriptive as the eventual product would be. So we take the building that I'm in, barring all of the material objects that populate it, that pepper the walls with art, that line the flooring with rugs that has a particular pattern, and the lamps that have particular artistic style to them. Outside of all of this that enhances the descriptiveness, we move back layer by layer, and we peel back things. And what we find is things continue to be descriptive, of course, but they are less, I don't want to say less purposeful. It's difficult to say, to use this analogy, because we're operating in I'm using an analogy, and a very descriptive analogy, to try to understand a determinate reality that is nondescript, that transitions into a descriptive reality. But at the very least, if we imagine the progression of the foundation, the laying of the studs, and and all of this, to the formation of rooms, which has a greater purpose than just the foundational layer, and from the creation of rooms to the plumbing and the electric, and from the plumbing and the electric we have the boundaries that take place, the firm boundaries that take place, not just the framing, but the drywall that goes up, and the purpose that goes into insulation. And so from this we have the expansion of difference in a more solidified sense. If it's more solidified, it's more intelligible, in the sense that it's a more stable identity. If all of our rooms were just these pieces of wood that serve as frames, eventually we'd figure out how to navigate these spaces. Maybe there's a space that's wide enough for a door, and we'd have this loose understanding of difference and separation, but it's not the same if the drywall was not there. Similarly, another added example is if the wall between my apartment and the next was not there, and it was just exposed by frame into the next, I would be able to see my neighbor, and it would be a rather strange living experience. But the fact that we have these boundaries makes things more identifiable. When we move away from this layer, from the drywall layer, we're getting into more of the particulars. We're getting into things that are very descriptive, the type of flooring, the organization of light fixtures and interior design, and then eventually it's furnished, which is farther descriptive, which gives these layers of these these properties on top of our foundational layer. And our foundational layer, in this sense, although it is descript, we are analogizing it to something that is nondescript, but rather determinate. And something that's determinate in this case can be something as simple as this room or not this room, that room. Again, inside, outside. There could be no walls, but there could be a concrete foundation. Foundation versus not foundation. And so we see how this can build over time. And even in the in the blankest of spaces, moving away from the one, the expression of oneness and being at the outset, we find these perforations away from the center, but also incorporating the center into the periphery somehow. This is sort of a proverbial and psalmist sort of view of things, that there is always a bit of the periphery in the center, and there's always a bit of the center in the periphery. Then insofar as it is in the others, it would touch the others, but insofar as it is in itself, it would be kept from touching the others. And being in itself would touch itself, apparently. Thus the one would touch itself and the others. It would. And again, says Parmenides, in this way, must not everything that is to touch something lie next to that which it is to touch, occupying the position adjacent to that occupied by what it touches. So too, the one, if it is to touch itself, must lie directly adjacent to itself, occupying a place next to that in which it itself is. Yes, it must. Now, if the one were two, it could do that and turn out to be in two places at the same time. But won't it refuse so long as it is one? Yes, you're quite right, says Aristotle. So the same necessity that keeps the one from being two keeps it from touching itself. The same. But it won't touch the others either. Why? Says Aristotle. Because we say that which is to touch must, while being separate, be next to what it is to touch, and there must be no third thing between them. So let me read that again. But it won't touch the others either, because we say that which is to touch must, while being separate, be next to that what it is to touch, and there must be no third thing between them. So there must be at least two things if there is to be contact. There must, says Aristotle. But if to the two items a third is added in a row, they themselves will be three, their contacts two. Yes, and thus whenever one item is added, one contact is also added. And it follows that the contacts are always fewer by one than the multitude of the numbers. For in regard to the number being greater than the contacts, every latter number exceeds all the contacts by an amount equal to that by which the first two exceeded their contacts, since thereafter one is added to the number, and at the same time one contact to the contacts. That's right. So, however many the things are in number, the contacts are always fewer than they are by one. True. But if there is only one, and not two, there cannot be contact. Obviously not. Certainly the things other than the one, we say, are not one and do not partake of it, if in fact they are other. No, they don't. So number is not in the others, if one is not in them. Obviously not. So the others are neither one nor two, nor do they have a name of any other numbers. No. So the one alone is one, and there cannot be two. Apparently not. So there is no contact, since there aren't two items. There isn't. Therefore, the one doesn't touch the others, nor do the others touch the one, since in fact there is no contact. Yes, you're quite right. Thus, to sum up, the one both touches and does not touch the others and itself, so it seems. So this is perfect Parmenides here. We're meant to explore both sides of the possibility, of the possibility spectrum. So I'm going to take this slow, and I'm going to take it painfully. There's a reflection in here somewhere about the nature of exhaustion and the desire to move forward. I experienced something earlier today for which I went back on a promise that I had to myself about exertion, and there were some positive things gained by going back on this and having some time to rest, but all the same, it's never an easy thing for the mind to accept a missed opportunity. And so I wish not to pass this over, even though what seems to be here can be quite straightforward, although made complicated by the language. So in essence, we are talking about the contrapoint in which the one does not touch itself, nor does it touch the others. Now, the first reasoning, he says, we say that which is to touch must, while being separate, be next to what it is to touch, and there must be no third thing between them. So the assumption is that there are potentially two things. In the prior paragraph, we discussed that in order for the one to touch itself, there has to be sort of a copy of the one touching itself. My perception at the outset is if one identity is going to touch itself, it's centralizing essence or aspect, the oneness, just like me-ness reaches with a part to touch itself. But at the same time, there is this purposeful desire to do so, to move and to touch myself. It does through by its parts, though. And so, is this a possible explanation that we can insert here? I'm not really sure. I don't think that's the most productive territory, though. But he indicates that there must be this closeness. There cannot be the third thing. It doesn't matter what it is. It's going to be too easy to get lost in the potential of things to make between one thing and another and then the third thing. Let's just imagine that the third thing is separation. We don't have to classify its identity at all. And so it would make sense that if there was separation between two things, their capacity for relating is going to be much less and absent, perhaps, depending on the nature of the separation. We imagine the scenario of the house being built, and we imagine the frames being an imperfect or perhaps improper boundary. But it's still a type of porous boundary. But the separation here, I think, is assumed that, especially from the ontological standpoint, if we're going to be thinking about a porous boundary, and yet a boundary nonetheless, we have two identities. We have the kitchen, we have the bathroom. It doesn't really matter if they're sort of left open by these wooden frame pieces. We can clearly, mostly, understand that one room is different from another. This, not that. So there must be at least two things if there is to be contact. Again, a part could be a thing. But if the two items But if to the two items a third is added in a row, they themselves will be 3. Their contact's 2. So we have a contact, so if it's, again, a linear progression from the 1, we have the third, or we have the second, and then we have the third. So this is kind of an interesting thought experiment, because we're getting into the mechanics of the 1 as it may push out linearly into determinate space, and then from determinate space into descriptive space. And this concept of context is not trivial, because again, just like we said with touch, we're thinking about something of a fundamental relation. It doesn't have to be thought of as a physical contact. It can, I suppose, but contact is a meeting. It's how does one identity maintain itself in the presence of another. And I go back to the example that we were using with the framing in a house. So we have a few different rooms, porous separation between them. In a linear sense, if we had a pure linear house, let's say, let's just say the room that I'm in right now, it's actually kind of an interesting experience. So there's a partition in the wall, in the sense that the height of the ceiling is higher in the living room than it is in the dining room, and there's a when somebody walks into the front door, there is a wall that's probably 4 feet in length, and that 4 foot in length extends all the way back to the kitchen. Well, actually, it extends into the dining room and then a small hallway, which goes then into the kitchen. But on the other wall, there is no divider, but the divider is almost essential in, well, at least it's very important. It's not the only thing that's essential to it. There's 2 components, I think, there. But it's one of the components by which there is some indication that the two rooms ought to be separate. The other one is that, as I mentioned, the ceiling height is different. And along with the ceiling height, there is a partition from the wall. So another partition from the wall. So there is the lower ceiling, and then there's part of the wall that separates, that's even lower than the lower ceiling. So what does that mean? So there is there's an added difference that serves as a boundary between these 2 spaces. Not only is there this 4 foot lengthwise protrusion from the living room to the dining room, there's also the ceiling height change and this drop of the wall that would seem like it's meant to separate the 2 spaces. And that's why typically this room, I'm sure, is designed to be living room and dining room. But the primary point here is that there is no physical partition. There's not even a porous partition. It's just open to that space. And there's some small indicators that these 2 things are meant to be separate and be independent identities, dining room and living room. Okay, so why do I mention this? I mentioned this as an extension of what we were already talking about. We mentioned the type of relation of a boundary being porous, as in the case of a framed room, not yet drywalled. But we can have an open space and have items or pillars that push the mind to consider something as an independent identity from something else. The easiest thing that we can do is to think about 2 things that are obviously separate, that are just in physical contact. But I want to expand this out, because the farther we expand it to the point where we're not sure between the boundary of one thing and another is where it kind of gets interesting. But I want to describe these spaces so we have a big picture of things. The last thing to reflect on here is one possibility that we have this thing, the 1, and then we're moving into determinate space. But even before that, I think we can imagine a more sophisticated environment in which the one, while it maintains itself, is sort of the ground, much like our image long ago with this sort of whitened backdrop. And there is this, what emerges is an articulate image of a tree that has a strong trunk that takes the oneness in being, and what differentiates this tree is not blank space, it's not nothingness, but rather differentiation. And the differentiation is the thing by which we are able to identify the uniqueness of the image that unfolds. And the imagery of the tree, I think, is important because as it branches out into the periphery, we have greater and greater descriptive aspects. And as we move into the trunk, and as it's less descriptive, and we move into the other space, we have more of the determinate space, which is this, not that. We have oneness in being, and all of this sort of thing. If we have three things in a row, the question is, well, are we to think about these three things in the fundamental linear sense? We can think about the three things in terms of the one, being, and oneness. Now, as an independent or individual identity, the three things aren't necessarily in a row, but they do come into contact with each other. And so far, I've been placing the essence of the one at the bridge of coherence between oneness and being. And so there's this sort of, as they meet together, they form this umbrella-esque structure that forms the firm boundary of their union. That is the identity of the one. And in this way, we would say that there are two contacts. That the one, being at the center of this bridge, meets oneness and being there. And so the third man in this argument is the one that coheres. It takes the identity. In the absolute linear sense, if we think about the one and then progression out from the one, we have the one and then something that is not the one. Then from something that is not the one, we have something that is not that thing that is not the one. And perhaps there's some farther description that we could point to for that thing, for the third thing. And in this way, a determinate progression would be the thing that characterizes contact or closeness or relation in that way. Parmenides continues and he says, and thus, whenever one item is added, one contact is also added. And it follows that the contacts are always fewer by one than the multitude of the numbers. And this is clear. I'm not really sure if there's much that we can add to this. Because again, he's speaking in linear terms here. For in regard to the number being greater than the contacts, every latter number exceeds all the contacts by an amount equal to that by which the first two exceeded their contacts, since thereafter one is added to the number, and at the same time one contact to the contacts. So however many the things are in number, the contacts are always fewer than they are by one. But if there is only one and not two, there cannot be a contact. So here again we come to this place in which we have an inside and outside dynamic. And so I think this is still important to the architecture. Early on I said that I'm not really sure what to make of this paragraph because it seemed like we covered this, or rather it seemed like, I suppose it seemed like we had covered this to a degree. But now it seems like it makes more sense that we would think about this. Regardless of Parmenides' intent here, it's giving us a fruitful place to operate, in the sense that in the first instance, when we were thinking about the possibility of one thing touching itself, we were forced with the recognition that the parts must come into play, and that there has to be the centralizing place for the identity. And what that centralizing place is, I think, depends on what the identity is. I think when we think about the analogy of the unfinished rooms with the framed walls, the identity is not just the boundary. The identity is the space. Perhaps most fundamentally it is the space. If we think about the analogy that I had given between my living room and the dining room, of course, the separation is very important. Without the separation, it would make less sense. So the separation is important. It's something that contributes to the identity. But the space is also something that is extremely important to the identity, because that's the thing that holds the things that eventually that will propagate that space and make it more descriptive. And the more descriptive it is, regardless of the boundary, gives it a greater and greater, gives the determinate features greater and greater weight, I think, it would seem, at least. And by greater and greater weight, I mean greater difference, greater stability. If I took all of the material items out of my apartment, I could just as easily reverse this and make the living room the dining room, although there would be some I think determinate inconsistencies with the way that I had done the designing. It's still possible to force it that way. And so it's a natural flow, it would seem, from the determinate to the descriptive. The determinate determines the basic structure and outline of the thing that will eventually become to be most purposeful and stable from the standpoint of an identity. So today happens to be a new day, and like always, a new day brings new thoughts. I'm not sure how long this little segment for the day is going to last. It's one of those days where I have felt myself sitting here waiting for a thought, being a bit passive. And of course that's no productive way to do productive things. And I also am not quite sure where we left off last time. I know where we left off in the dialogue, but I don't necessarily know where I left off conversationally. So hopefully this is a good place to break and begin anew. Parmenides says, so however many the things are in number, the contacts are always fewer than they are by one. But if there is only one and not two, there cannot be contact. So I'm beginning to remember where we were yesterday. This linearity of things, of things coming into contact. And we were discussing our determinate phase moving into something that's more descriptive. We're talking about different types of boundaries, different types of relationships there. Parmenides continues and he says, certainly, the things other than the one, we say, are not one and do not partake of it, if in fact they are other. I think we've been through this exercise. I can't really remember. It sounds familiar, but I think it's worth going over again. When we think about the one, we think about its relationship to other things. We have a three-part thing, or maybe, yeah, I would say it's a three-part thing. And I'm a bit hesitant to say that, perhaps. I think that there are different ways in which we can consider it. I'm not sure at what level it matters. I'm sure it matters at some point, but the place that we are at now, I think there's still some playful room there. So what do I mean by this? When we say the one, what we have is an identity that's composed of two parts. We have oneness and we have being. I've been using the third thing as the bridge of coherence, and that bridge of coherence happens to be the one. Now, what I'm uncertain about is if this is a good move, to say that there is this equivalence, that is, the expression of the one is because of the unity of oneness and being. I'm not really sure why there's a hesitation there. Perhaps there doesn't need to be. I'm leaving it open to more and perhaps a more sophisticated interpretation. But I think what it does well is at least indicates that the thing that we see includes its parts. I think that's fundamental to any whole, that the things that make it up are present and active. Perhaps there is a reductionist error somewhere in here, though, that when we say the one is just its parts, we would miss something, perhaps. That's why we have this bridge of coherence. It is the union of the two, the complex interweaving of the two. And while a bridge may signify one point of crossing, we could say that oneness and being have bridges of coherence. These bridges of coherence are manifested in all things that are. And because it is expressed in all things that are, we have it also expressed in all things that are one. So all things that are one happen to be, just as all things that are happen to be one. Now, when we speak about otherness, we have to wonder, well, where is the role of otherness? Where is the role of things that seem to be not one, let's say? And therein lies our project of layered weaving. I think there's a better term that we can come up here, better than layered weaving, but what I mean by that is, much like in The Statesman, where we're talking about an individual that is responsible for weaving fundamental parts together in order to produce a harmonious and stable unity. I think what is on hand in the mind, where the purpose, the agentic push perhaps, I do think that in this space, purpose is important. I think this can be explored at more fundamental levels, but I do think purpose is important. For when we have an identity that we would say is other than the one, it's not just the purity of the thing, of the interactions that we're talking about. The interactions have become nuanced. They become colored, let's say. I think purposeful is potentially a useful term here, because right after our fundamentals, our coherence of oneness and being, and then difference being cut through all of it, we have the emergence of these very, very simple, determinate characteristics. Characteristics, but maybe not a good word to use in our ontological landscape. I think identity works here. In our nomenclature, identity is something that precedes property, or characteristic, or kind, or property. And so in this landscape, what we have is very basic determinate features. This, not this. Inside, outside. Like and unlike. Same and different, perhaps. I think that would apply. And then we have a progression of this, and we think about the potential for liminality, for shape, for when geometry enters into the equation. We have much like we do with the one, we have an idea that their particular way of being, of having a boundary, of participating with another thing, that this pushes the realm of difference onto a new tier or a new scale. And this tier is at a place where I think property begins to come into focus. For now, we have something that is descriptive of something on the most basic level, one of the most basic levels. I'm not sure if there's others, but I think this is at least somewhat of a logical step, so we can start to fill this in more. And by descriptive, I mean that it describes an aspect of a thing that is fit into a class of things, for which kind is a component. What class are they in? It's in a class of things that are able to be characterized, because a property, the stable, uh, coherent relations among properties give something its character. So we come back to this idea that saying something other than the one is problematic in a way, because the one is in all things. However, in another instant, it depends on what? It depends on a type of interaction of information, I suppose. How would this information interact exactly? Am I deceiving myself in thinking that this might be the case because I'm an observer existing at one level of this thing? If we follow our same principles, we start from the one. We have oneness in being, and we insert other into that equation. How is this thing defined by that expression of oneness in being? How is otherness defined in this way? And I think otherness is defined in this way in the sense that what is created is sort of like a pocket. It's a pocket of oneness in being. And we can tell that this is a particular level and layer because it's beyond what we began talking about. It's beyond just the principled layer of oneness in being, though it starts there. It's beyond determinations of things, being this, that, light, dark, on, off, 1, 0. It's not completely different from it, but because it participates in it, but it's still beyond that in a certain context. Or perhaps it's easier to see when it's beyond this. So let me back up for a moment. I want to back up because I'm trying to perceive otherness at a particular level. But I don't think we need to, and Parmenides already offers us this thought experiment. Actually, a lot. Many times, I should say. Now, what do I mean by this? I think even on the most fundamental scale, the place that we wished to start to insert otherness, we wished to go far away from the one, so we didn't have to perhaps expose ourselves to an intimate problem. I'm not really sure if that's the reason, but that was the initial inclination anyway. And so what perhaps we should do is to say, okay, the one has this influence, this sort of ground by which things are planted, and subsequent things are grown. Rather, the soil must contain within it the possibility. So what is this otherness? things other than the one, we can take individual principles and say that they are other than the one, oneness and being. Do we say that they exist without the one? Perhaps not. It would seem that both are necessary at the outset. That they didn't necessarily become parts of something. They always were parts of something. And while it's still possible to think of oneness and being as individual entities, by the instability of their singularity, it is unreasonable for us to go back to that place. Now, we did find reason in it in the early dialogue, which I think right now is fascinating to reflect back on. We found the coherence in a type of purity that did not participate in an articulate order. We have now brought everything forward to participate in an articulate order. But a pure principle would be one that doesn't articulate with anything. There is no difference. There's no difference and there's no identity. Because the definition of identity is that it's stable across difference. But if there's no difference, then there's nothing to be stable across. So the term identity couldn't be used there, although you could still consider the purity of a principle. But now we find ourselves in a place where, regardless of being able to consider that, it's not coherence, so we can't just go down that road. But we have a coherence now, which is the one. And so while I think the possibility is left there to be open or perhaps fulfilled, in our initial condition there is a stable order between oneness and being. There is a coherence between the two. And that otherness is not to be defined by incoherence. Rather, it is to be defined by a type of coherence. Now, what type of coherence would this be? The type that... Now, here's where I come back to my previous thought. Parmenides has prompted us to go down a few different tributaries. And one has been to think about things that already have become determined. Again, not just sort of left open to possibility landscape that's afforded by the one. It has moved somewhere. There's sort of this purposeful intent that I've been getting to. Now, this purposeful intent, perhaps we'll leave for a moment. Maybe we'll define it as we go. But as we have things that are determined, otherness is brought from possibility landscape to actioned landscape. This and not that, or this not this or that. This distinction alone, I think, is something that affords otherness. That otherness is within the relation. It's not in some incoherence, obviously, because the two obviously must be coherent in order for there to be any interaction among them. And so by perspective, we say that something is not something else. As soon as we move to this to that becomes this, and this becomes that. So my apologies, but I think that I'm going to have to make a break with that previous thought and begin anew, since it's a new day. I'm not really sure where we are going to go. I tried to add a couple things on to the tail end of the thought from yesterday, but nothing productive came of it, so I didn't really feel like it was necessary to continue that. But we'll make our way back into it. So I figured I'd stop for a moment and smell the roses. There's been an ongoing reflection of late about the nature of discipline, I suppose, and removing those barriers to productive efforts, productive striving. And I suppose what's useful to say about the potential state for which we might find ourselves in more of a passive disposition, or of wanting just sort of a mindless experience of life, despite the fatigue. That in these moments, it's an insult to a broader image of a fuller human experience. Fuller, but by the same token, harmonized human experience. So therein lying something that would, their resting would be something that understands when it's okay to let the mind find its peace at a lower level of exertion, I suppose. Now, this might be a strange way to put it. Even to myself, I feel that this is a bizarre way to approach this. But the desire for an absent mind, I think, is something that extends beyond just clearly extends beyond what I've just mentioned, because I'm wishing for it. I don't wish the mind to be subject in an unjust way, let's say. Subject to something else that is not good, let's say. And I think there are varying degrees of this not good situation or scenario. Some of them can be quite in your face, and others can be seemingly harmless. And it's the strange thing I found about life, that no matter how much I may give, there is that strategic placing of oneself, to have the sort of extended identity working for one's own experience. Having stable light cones in areas where that which is known meets the periphery. Not even just that, though, because working in that territory, I think, is productive. That's where creation occurs. But the heart is a curious animal. The lower mind has its desires, and they say many things in ancient language. Not that I've outgrown it, of course. It is an ongoing participant in this sort of parliamentary structure that is my mind. I sort of wonder about that last statement. If I have to give it a structure other than just sort of obnoxious language, I wonder if I would say parliamentary. Well, there are centralizing aspects of it, and it's not so differentiated as to have or maybe at least to be aware of all of the interwoven thoughts and words and letters and desires of the heart. If each one of these had some equal representation in my mind, I would have to think that I would be limited in some way. Limited in the sense that at the top there is that the strong voice, I'll say, that is commanding the weaker voice. And of course that's a kingdom. And the kingdom then surrenders his authority to something higher. You know, sometimes I wonder just being and not doing anything destructive. Perhaps we would say that it's a passive expression, because under this distinction, I or some person would be doing fairly minimal work. The mind would be instructed to calm its desire, to calm its uncertainty, or what seems like the static noise. The echoes of voices that are all incoherent and muddled together to produce something that is deafening, whatever that thing is. We say, let it be. Let it play its course. let all of the otherness, the discoordination, the what may appear to you, what may eventually become some sort of spirit that occupies that innocence, this sort of discharge of activity, that if it is not guarded against in that state, then it can be used to destructive ends, and those destructive ends may grow. And so the question is, what are those ends that are, in our hypothetical, the protector of the innocence? Where do we keep that that possibility for exploration and curiosity within a disciplined framework? And it should be said that there are plenty of things that are already structured that may give proper instruction to a mind that is living as a territory between two sort of occupied forces. One is dominant and culturally dominant. The other is an offshoot. It's something that was a thought and had died, and now there's this sort of ghost that's haunting it. We may ask our sort of etiology of ghost presence, but the patterns in life that are revealed to us, I think, are often beautiful and at the same time unsettling if we see it at any particular length. And so while I'm trying to keep in mind a healthy balance between that sort of melancholy sadness for this, that, and the other, to make it more sensible, with the other side that is meant to be driving and uplifting and creative. It is, I think it is this thing that is dominant in, it's dominant in life, I would say, in my life. But I do know that there are areas for which the other occupying identity, we can call it, is no longer serving the surrounds that are much improved by the former. And so this goes back to the innocence, because the result of the passive disposition in the unproductive context is a tiring, an exhaustion, a weakness of mind to maintain its rightful orientation. Now, what do I mean by that? Too vague. Identities are oriented to plenty of different things. Just ago I mentioned that I'm calling an aspect of myself, or at least a pattern of my behavior, an identity. Now perhaps that's not a good word to use because there's a big difference between identity as in myself, the one that is speaking, the agent, and that partition of parts, which the parts, each one of them individually, has that depth to it that we can think of it on that level. And we should, I think, but altogether not getting lost in the zooming in of these matters. I think the more we go on these little exercises for just giving a light to those territories that we're not there in time, there is this map. It's giving a lot of light. We have a lot of territory, a lot of different land and analogies to traverse through. So going back to what I was saying about this identity within an identity situation, we can use another word for it. We could say it's a servant identity. The servant identity is well, maybe this distinction won't work. Because if it were a servant identity, it wouldn't have any authority or control. And so in terms of relating, it's more of an enemy, but part of the self can't be an enemy unless part of the self is destroyed. And in the completeness of what that would mean, not necessarily destroyed and then there's new growth into what has left, but I mean destroyed in an evil sense. If it is to be redeemed, it must reorient to a state that satisfies without giving, again in the absolute sense, in the process of becoming stronger and surrendering that weakness, when the moments of weakness do come, that they are not these experiences that lead the mind away from thinking about its experience and moving towards something that offers a greater understanding and participation in it. And oh man, we have so many things that we can use to distract us, to move away from where we should be, have that sort of mindless part of ourselves be occupied by any identity that is out there in our environments, some corporate identities, advertising, global conflicts, and all of this sort of thing. It's not to say that identity interaction in itself is bad. I think it's necessary. It informs us. It gets us outside of ourselves. Whereas the dangers of the inner self and the inner confinement are sort of on one hand a curse, I would say. It's a curse if one surely found to enjoy it. But it's a stunting environment. It's an environment that leads to death in its extreme. But anyway, let's try to recenter this on the dialogue and move forward. So Parmenides says, is it then both equal and unequal to itself and the others? And so this is where we began to give our big overview of where we are, and I gave a couple of ideas about the language that we were using, trying to solidify it in my mind, make it more robust. We talked about otherness and its cooperation with the one. I think what we should do now is, especially since this has been a return topic, a repeating topic, is to talk about that which is equal and that which is unequal. Because herein lies a near synonymous term. I say near because I want to leave some space there. I have some reservation about saying that they are exactly the same as, but the word the same and difference, I think, also fits here between equal and unequal. So it seems, so far at least, the most compelling argument for how the one maintains this seeming difference and maybe I should use language in slightly a different way here. What is maintained is the multiplicity of being and the unification of being. And so as a matter of scale, once we get past the singular, and we find ourselves in the multitude, which we've discussed, we don't even need to go to these multiplicitous examples in the extreme, though it might help us to see it from a different perspective. I think when we went into it thinking about the one as being composed of this tripartite experience, the coherence, the bridge, oneness and being, that even there we have the pattern playing out. As far as equal is concerned, there's a lot of peripheral language, I think. And with words in general, I think these terms that may, from a common perspective, or colloquial perspective, maintain a degree of permissibility, given the context, such that its meaning is not necessarily the same, hard-coded in every single utterance of its name. And sometimes, although when it is used, there has to be the sort of connection to where it is most fundamental, perhaps. Or maybe there are words where this is not the case, I'm not really sure. It's maybe more of a loose conglomeration of relative meanings that cohere together for that thing to be something that is coherent. But I think generally speaking, words have a center point, a meaning that is rooted quite firmly, and that root maintains its meaning, so that when we speak to each other, we can understand each other. Putting, just for a moment, let's think about the word equal as a static term. Let's push aside some cultural changes that might occur in terms of equality or equivalence, cultural linguistic changes. And let's try to speak on the root of what this word is, equal. Now, for some reason, more so than the word same, I've thought equal or equivalence to be more of a pure term, because I think of mathematics. We say 1 equals 1. What does it mean? It means that the value is the same on one side versus the other. Now, what does this mean? I think we're getting to this distinction, visually speaking. 1 equals 1. You write it out on a paper. Visually speaking, this is where I'm starting from. On the other side, when I say that expression, I mean it to be on the other side of the equal symbol, equal sign. Now, is this important? I'm not sure, but this is where we're starting. So 1 equals 1. On first pass, it is clear that we have two identities, at least when it's written on paper, because we say 1 equals 1. And when it's written on the paper, we have two distinct numbers, 1 and 1. It's their relation that is signified by the sign. So, for example, we may have two identities, but if the sign is signaling a different type of relationship, we're going to have a different equivalence. Like 1 plus 1 or 1 minus 1 is not going to be 1. But 1 equals 1 is 1 because of the distinction. That's very basic. I understand that, but it's important for my process of thinking through this. I think what's more relevant, I should say, I was going to say more important, but more relevant to what we've been talking about has been this idea of determinate expressions used to describe identity prior to the introduction of descriptive descriptors, I should say. I was going to say descriptive qualities, but I didn't want to be redundant because a quality is inherently a type of description, but nonetheless. In the determinate landscape, we have very basic language. This and that. This, not this. Being, non-being. Well, I don't want to speak to non-being in this context just yet. But let's say this, not this, or this and that. This and that is probably the best to use. Difference, or non-being, as it permeates that landscape, provides a sign. What sign is it? It's hard to say. It depends on the situation, depends on the context, depends on where it's moving. But in this particular instance, we understand what the sign is. It's equal. And so we still have the same determinate features. We have this and that. But the queen says that they are equal. The queen, again, is our symbol for non-being. Non-being, the action of non-being is difference. So the sign serves as our representation for the relationship between this and that. Now, if they are equal, they are still divided which I find interesting. And there are many types of division, some more simple than others. But because they are divided, they share, at least from an equal standpoint, they share as many fundamental qualities as possible, except maybe one: the fact that they are separated, the fact that they are different, maybe. They could be separated by distance. They could be separated on a page. They could be separated in mind. They could be separated by a superficial, small stroke of the pen on a page, or some printing error. But the fact that they are two separate identities probably is the most fundamental thing that one can say. That they are it's a stable continuity of determinate and descriptive features that remain stable over time, and yet they don't occupy the same being. Now, this is one level of that which is equal. And I think that there's another level, a little bit more of an intimate level. And I'm not really sure what to do about this level. This level is what I call equivalence by mirror. That is, when I go up to my bathroom and I walk to the mirror, I have the light on and I see myself. The thing that is projecting back at me is an equivalence of myself. Now, of course, there are plenty of things that aren't produced imagistically to get an understanding of what the totality of that being is. But just from a basic analogistic standpoint, it serves our purpose. True knowing of all things in our case is not possible. True knowing in all senses, but most fundamentally in terms of perspective. When I look in the mirror, I can't see the back of my head. If I'm looking at the back of my head in some hall of mirrors, let's say, I'm not really looking at anything else. I'm not looking I'm not looking underneath my skin. What's exposed to me are not all of my failures and all of my wishes and desires and the connections between the desirings and the sufferings of the heart and my logical, reasoned approach to understanding things that are just full stop. As much as I am aware of that without looking at a mirror, it still remains elusive. That's just sort of part of our experience. That's part of the nature of being a human being. But if we put that aside for a moment, and we just sort of think about this mirror and what it tells us, what we are thinking about, what we are exposed to, is a concept, something that exists, but it exists in mind. It exists in potential. What do I mean by this? Maybe not even potential. It exists in a projection, a generative projection. So that projection, of course, is something that is, because it is a thought. It is one thing. It participates in the one. But it doesn't fulfill the identity landscape in the same way. What do I mean by this? Perhaps it does. There's quite a difference between 1 equals 1 and 1 mirror 1. For the mirror, is self-reflection. It is the process of self-reflection. It is not another identity. So let's talk for a moment about its usefulness. Why would we have the second derivation of equivalence? What usefulness does it provide us? I think it provides us with a sense of purity that is not seen in the 1 = 1 scenario. There are many blades of grass. We can make the argument that not one blade of grass is the same as another, which of course is true. But as far as their multiplicitous expression goes, we essentially view one blade of grass, one patch of grass, and the individual pieces of grass is essentially the same. But there's a sameness in terms of where we are in the descriptive landscape of the identity. And it makes sense to describe this territory in this way, or to use that language at least, because they occupy a certain taxonomy and the occupation within the taxonomy is not there is not a requirement to have their difference be the thing that excludes them from that taxonomy. So in other words, as far as our conversation of layers goes, or fractaling goes, there's a few other words that I'm sure that we can use here. There are layers of interpretation by which we may find a multiplicitous descriptive landscape that includes much difference, even between things that we in common language would call the same. Doesn't mean that they're not the same, but there are certain ways in which they're not the same. And so the way has to do with relations. It has to do with separation. It has to do with any combination of these basic descriptors, determinate features, and perhaps more and more complicating descriptive factors. Maybe complicating not because of one individual description, but because of many descriptions that move them along that taxonomic system. Okay, so where does it leave us in terms of what Parmenides is saying here? Is it then both equal and unequal to itself and the others? It depends on the context. On one hand, the one is the same as itself because of this mirroring. In the purest sense, there is that sameness. On the other hand, it's different from itself because you can have an identity that is expressed through the coherence of oneness and being, and yet be different from a different identity that's also expressed through the coherence of oneness and being. This is the influence of non-being, let's say, from the dialogue of the sophist. Or I like to call it the queen's influence. So let's move into talking about the unequal. In some sense, this is much easier, because if we start with 1 does not equal 2, we have our equal sign with a slash through it. This is our sign of relation between two identities. And in this case, we can expound almost infinitely. Perhaps we can expound infinitely on the potential of differences between one identity and another. Now there are, when I say expound, I mean more so that we can run through the intellectual exercise. I don't mean to say that the ways in which one thing and something else are different are infinite. I think that there is a definite way to describe a relation of something, and it's perhaps dynamic, so you might need a screenshot, an initial condition, and then a series of observational points by which you observe how the relations change, especially when we're talking about more complicated things like the self and how it grows as we age and mature and go through different experiences and transform. One of the amazing things about man is his capacity for the religious experience, religious transformation in particular. Because despite the shape that the mind has come to in relation to its environment, it can radically alter the way in which it interacts and sees itself in the environment by guided willful exercise and discipline. But anyway, I say that because that experience has within it the capacity for profound transformation, and so the identity states in question, while there might be a strong similarity at the root, similarities at the root from one condition to the next, it would be quite surprising, I think, to go through the exercise of thinking about the relations of the self to itself, I should say, and then the self to its environment at each one of these sort of check-in points, observational check-in points. Now I say that because even within our lives, we have states of that which is unequal. I was unequal to myself this morning. I was unequal to myself 10 years ago. I am unequal to myself 10 years ago. Some of these might be significant, some of them are minimal. But the point being is that leaving the sandbox of this and that, of the determinations, once we get out into this descriptive landscape, things are wildly interconnected and interwoven, and it can be quite difficult to synthesize things. What we've been doing so far seems to be so basic, just to give us a comprehensive, common framework by which we understand how all of these pieces play together. And once we understand more of the global image of how these pieces are playing together, then we begin to do some very serious exercise as it relates to the specific relations among things, how light cones perhaps are maybe shared between identities, and how sophisticated these types of relations can be. And we've already discussed this to a degree through the analogy of the house that's being built and the separation from one room to another before the drywall is put on. I gave an example about my apartment and the separation of room, even if there's no physical barrier. Just general cues within the environment that leads one to almost intuitively separate out two different spaces. Is it then both equal and unequal to itself and the others? To this, Aristotle says, how so? If the one were greater or less than the others, he says, or they in turn greater or less than it, they wouldn't be in any way greater or less than each other by the one being one and the others being one than one. That is, by their own being, would they? Okay, so that reading wasn't all that great, and I'm sure it's hard to comprehend based on the way I read that, but I want to take this step by step. Now, he gives the hypothetical. He says, if the one were greater or less than the others, so starting very simple, how would we conceptualize of the one being greater or less than something else? Now, greater or less, I think, is a determinate feature. And the question is, when we say the one, are we referring to the identity? And I'm taking it as, yes, we are referring to the one as the identity of the thing that is the coherence between oneness and being. If the one were greater or less than the others, what would it mean to be for the one to be greater than the others? Greater in scale? What does that mean? Especially in the pre-descriptive landscape, when we don't really have material objects. What does it mean to be greater than something else? Is it greater by value? Greater by productive effort? Greater by purpose? Greater by influence, which I suppose would be related to some of the things I've already mentioned, but I think this gives us a general information to support where I'm going here. And on the flip side, what would it mean for the one to be less than something else? So one thing that we have been doing is imagining things in a linear progression, and this linear progression may come with certain implications, or at least as it relates to that which is greater or that which is lesser. When we think about things moving away from the one or outwards from the one, it's possible to think about things in both ways. On one hand, when we're moving away from the one, we have something that is, it's by difference and by multiplicity, we have the experience and the possibility that is afforded through the layered connections among things, that we have such an abundance of potential for beauty and for perhaps the opposites of things. I was about to list good things, and then I was thinking also about their opposites. I mean, the vast potential is there. It seems quite clear. But the reason I mention that is because when we move ourselves out in this direction, it's easy to see that among the first few determinate features of things that are brought into an identity at time zero, let's say, we have two very new and big concepts that have emerged that participate in the one, but they are not the one. They utilize the principles, They are born in the soil that the one provides. But the flowering is unique to that identity. And it's not requisite that it is equal to the one, but rather participates in it. By the flip side, we can think about the progression away from the one as something that's smaller, and it's differentiated, multiplicitous, but still it affords this fractal expansion of oneness and being. If the one were greater or less than the others, or they in turn greater or less than it, they wouldn't be in any way greater or less than each other, by the one being one and the others being other than one. If we take it the next step and we interpret, or they in turn greater or less than it, the logic still applies, and perhaps it may not be useful to go through this, but I think there's some utility in going through that minutia to have a solid grounding. If we take the others, and the others can be interpreted as an identity that's independent of the one but participates in the one's coherence. We could think about others as some multiplicitous unity that sort of comes together by its own chaotic features. Whatever we want to use to describe otherness, we can use that. And as a matter of scale, when we think about otherness participating, there's both bigness and smallness. It's not one or the other. It's, on one hand, a matter of perspective, and on the other hand, a matter of orientation or of relation. So I think I'm going to end this episode here and continue next time with part 15 of Parmenides.